detailing, I stared at that thing every day for a couple months. And then I went and visited. And then I went, holy crap.
When I was a design engineer, I wasn't really engineering anything. It was really just application.
Engineers have just gotten farther away from the product. The product they make is three-dimensional model. That's not the product, though. The product is the building.
Did you guys watch the Super Bowl?
Yeah, we were talking about this
You were
while you
watching
were
the
getting everything
Oh,
ready.
sorry.
The planning of this, just being here and doing this on Super Bowl Monday, Super Bowl Monday morning, and Super Bowl Monday morning after we all had a thunderstorm roll through the house, and everybody's kids were up last night.
If you're really quiet, you can hear the rain still hitting the roof right now.
Beautiful white noise. It was thunder and lightning last night.
Yeah. Dude, so I'm not a football fan at all, but last night really got me.
It was a great game.
That was a really good game.
Good. It was.
Holy cow.
Intrigue. There's a plot behind it all.
Taylor Swift is somehow in there too.
Yeah,
It's great.
of course.
I thought that was the plot.
That was the plot. What was cracking me up is anytime anybody mentioned or looked at Kelce, it immediately cut to Taylor. Every single time, I'm like, this is just hysterical, dude.
Yeah.
And my wife, who is a Swiftie, like full stop, she was like getting angry about it. She was like, she's just lying, man. Just lying her pants. This is PR. This is all PR. Dude, she was on it.
Oh, wow.
Well, my wife,
It was so
like
funny.
at the end of the game, my wife's like, well, where's Taylor? I see Travis on the field with Taylor. I was like, well, babe, the game's over. Like, the relationship's done. It's over. The gig's up. It's done.
That's right.
All the PR's been had. Now the songs can be written.
That's right.
That's where it's going.
New record's already been announced. It's coming out. It's done. It's over. Yeah.
Yeah, I was kind of, I was thinking, hey, it'd be pretty epic if he proposed on the field or something like that. Could you imagine the meltdown that would happen?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh,
Well, you could bet on it. Apparently, there was a prop bet around that.
Was there?
Yeah, I don't bet. It's not like a thing I do, but I heard about
Over
that.
under on will he propose to her? Like,
Yes or no? Will he propose to her after the game?
My
Amazing.
gosh. That's
And
Vegas
to
made
my
some
knowledge,
money.
he did not. I have not heard. My phone has not exploded today, so I assume it didn't happen.
I'm a little annoyed that you went ahead and brought this up because
Why?
we've been dealing with this, and now this is going to come out after everybody's put it to bed, and we're just going to raise this back. It was resurrected.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, everybody. It's fresh on our minds right now.
Even
It's
you
relevant
are
right now.
trying to
It is.
get Taylor Swift PR into the show. Even you are doing
Listen,
it.
I can mention Taylor Swift and immediately get 15,000 views on our videos. So I'm playing the game right now, man. All right.
I can tell my daughters that we talked about Taylor Swift on the show. They might actually listen to one.
Hey, look
May.
at that. Hey.
So
Let's get more women in construction. That's how
Right.
we do
That's right.
Don't cancel me. Okay, so commissioning
Yeah.
is what's on the table today.
nice. Well done.
Thank you.
Smooth as
Great
silk.
clean transition. Yep.
Smooth.
Been doing this for years, guys. I'm still figuring it out. So, all right. So, Darren, you're in commissioning as well as you, Jeffrey. You guys work together, and Melanie Ford introduced us.
That's right.
You guys. So let's kick off by who are you, what you do.
Jeffrey Michael. I've been in the design and construction world for going on 15 years. Before that, spent a little time in manufacturing. Got my degree at University of Georgia. And I would say I have a pretty strong kind of controls background. I designed buildings for a while, and then that kind of sent me down the commissioning path. And have been pretty well focused on that for, the past 6 or 7 years, doing it for the past 12 or 13 years. And I'm now going to go do it for myself for a while.
Heck yeah. So when you say controls, can you define that for me a little bit?
Sure. So my background, a little more industrial controls, so more like automation, right? So think automated guided vehicles, assembly lines inside a manufacturing facility, welding robots, things like that, right? Touch screens, PLCs. And now in the commercial sector, more like building controls, HVAC, could be lighting, Could be security. Could be a handful of things. Yeah.
That's what I was thinking. I wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
So I had a hunch about what commissioning was, and it was completely wrong. But Darren, how about you, man? What do you do?
Yeah, I'm Darren Draper. I'm a principal at Epstein Group in Atlanta. We're a company part of Salas O'Brien, which is a big MEP firm across the country. And so my background is commissioning since I got out of college. I actually started in HVAC working for my father during the summers as my teenage years in Middle Georgia, close to here, Warner Robins.
Yep.
Back when it was still cool to make your kid work, like actual work, do labor. And maybe it's okay still, I don't know. But I climbed through attics, I toted tools, I welded copper poorly, mostly helping real installers and service technicians do their work. And then went to Mercer University. I'm a mechanical engineering degree from Mercer. And between those two things, I think I interviewed for a position as a design engineer at a big firm in Atlanta. And they were like, you seem like you'd be a better fit for commissioning. You went to Mercer, Georgia Tech, and maybe you give that a shot. And I got into it then, been doing it ever since, love it. And I do, similar to Jeffrey, most of my daily life is controls, which is funny because I remember a controls class in college, and we talked about proportional and integral control loops and things like that. I don't remember a ton about it, but I remember the instructor telling me or explaining this with a satellite dish, old school satellite dish that might be in your yard that turns at a certain speed. That's controls. I said, I'm never going to use this ever. And I literally do it almost every single day. Not with satellite dishes, but with building HVAC, electrical systems. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Sounds like the accounting class I took. Never going to use this. I'm like, gosh, I wish I'd have paid more attention. So does our accountant.
Right. Poor Stacy. Poor Stacy. So, all right. So let's dive into what is commissioning. This word keeps coming up. Define it. Who wants to go? Like,
I love this part.
Is it?
For most of my career, I couldn't explain it in the form of an elevator pitch. I think the cleanest way to describe it is we are there. We as commissioning agents are there to ensure the building operates the way the owner wanted it to, simply put. And there's a bunch of things that go into making that happen, but that is the intent of the process.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you specify an HVAC unit, you're coming in, you're checking to make sure that it is doing what it is supposed to do.
Exactly right.
And that can take on a lot of different forms. Obviously.
Absolutely.
Not just HVAC, but tons of stuff.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. In today's buildings, it's they're almost all in some way complicated. Even the basic coffee shop down the street with a boring old rooftop unit on it, the energy code has made those units complicated. To the point where someone really needs to check them. It doesn't have to be a commissioning agent on simple things, but someone needs to take ownership of checking to make sure it works. So
yeah. How did you guys get connected? Like, because I know Melanie put you two together. How did you guys get connected? And,
I mean, for years we worked. For many years, we worked independently at UGA, right, as consultants for them. And I went to engineering school with a couple of folks that are like in the facilities department at UGA. So, I mean, I had known Epstein actually when I was still in school there. And so I knew the group, I knew the company. And Melanie and Dane at UGA kept saying, you guys don't know each other? You guys are a lot alike. You guys are really good to get on well. You would, and you work well together. So you would. And we teamed up on a project together, and that was it. And now we continue to team up.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, Melanie is the common glue there as well for us. So it's been a few years now. We've worked together mostly on campus at UGA.
And then strangely, not long after our first kind of project teaming up together, we found out that we shared a common softball team together that I had only ever played in the spring, and then Darren had missed a couple of seasons. And then last fall, we determined that, we played softball with these guys in different team arrangements for years.
That's a sore subject for me. That's a very sore subject for me because I had to go to the hospital last softball season. But anyway, Eddie, take your line of questioning now. We'll get out of here.
All right, my understanding of commissioning was it related a lot more to documentation, but there's this whole testing side of things. So in my mind, I'm thinking they were just documenting what was on like the CDs and making sure that we kind of wrap everything up and turn it over. That's an element of it, but what kind of testing are you doing on a building? You have like the rooftop units, with like controls. What other stuff do you do?
Yeah, so the commissioning started out 20-something years ago or more with just testing, really. Okay, there's a process that ASHRAE developed with a guideline they called Guideline 0, which I think they mean is that significant. It's more important than one. I don't know. And then they created a standard 202, and it's largely a process about documentation gathering, but the technical expertise around it largely focused on testing equipment, right? And so testing systems involves us writing test procedures based on the design documentation that usually says what a piece of equipment is supposed to do. And for most of the projects that he and I work on, that sequence of operation is what it's called, SOO, can be pages and pages long. Scripts are, hundreds of lines long to see that it does all of these things: safeties, failure modes, setbacks, optimization strategies, all of this stuff that's baked into these design documents now that, 40 years ago wouldn't have existed. It was largely on-off or very modest, and now it all goes back to a computer screen with some graphics on it. And so we're entrusted to test it and tell the owner if it works or not.
And if you think about like a typical construction arrangement, like let's just say contractual arrangement, right? You might think of it like a pyramid or like a upside down V, right? You got the owner at the top, and down one leg of it, you've got your architect, and then your MEP, and then the rest of the subs, right? So you've got that one side, and then the opposite side of that, you've got coming from the owner, you've got your construction manager or your GC, and then all their subs, right? And so if you were to follow a chain of command, right, up and down those columns, you're going to see a lot of degrees of separation between your design engineer who's putting that sequence on paper, through the architect, through the owner, back down through the construction manager, through the GC, through their subs, which to get to the control sub, you've got to go through the mechanical sub, right, in order to get there. So now you're 6 degrees separated, right, from the inputs to the outputs, right, if you think about them in our terms. And so I think just saying that alone lays out the challenges between making sure that the outputs of a controls contractor is what the inputs of the engineer intended it to be, right? So really, testing for us is like the linchpin in it all, right? It's regardless of what the documentation says, regardless of how well it's documented, and that all the documents are in the right folders and the right subfolders and have the right people's names and stamps on them, right? It's at the end of the day, you've got to turn that building back over. That owner's going to own it. Does it do what it was intended to do? And a lot of times, does it do it safely, right? Does it do it to the extent that when there's smoke in the ductwork, that the smoke detector detects it and shuts the whole system down? Or does it feed a fire oxygen, right? Well, we certainly don't want that, right? And so, there's some subtlety to it, because for those 40 years, like Darren's describing, you expected the contractor to deliver that, right? And we still do. We just want to test it, right? That's all.
Yeah, and sorry, go ahead.
Well, you work as a third party. And so speak to that. Like, who hires you, and how important is it that you're a third party?
So we as commissioning authorities, commissioning providers, want to work for the owner. We want to be contracted directly to them. And the primary reason is to preserve objectivity. We do not want to be answerable to the contractor or to the architect or the engineer. And it's not because we have any issues with them. It's just you can't be truly objective if your paycheck is being signed by the architect or the engineer or the contractor. There are plenty of instances where that does happen, and there's a million reasons why, some of which is just you need to butter your bread, but the right place to be is contract direct to owner, so you have independent third-party objectivity in that position.
Okay.
So.
That makes a lot of sense. How did you guys learn this? Like I said, I know you were in engineering school and everything, but dude, this seems like it's a lot more dynamic than just going to school for this.
It's pretty
right?
niche, yeah, I'd say. I would say it's more industry driven, right? It's really just been, as like Darren described, complication within systems has grown, right? And then, you take the controls market, let's just say like the controllers themselves, right? Kind of disparate. And it has been for forever, right? The technology that's used in commercial controls of buildings has been around it's the same technology that's been around for 60 years, right? It's just some analog or digital inputs and outputs, and that's really it. So it's really more like kind of catching up, right? The industry is really catching up with what real controls, let's say on the industrial scale, has been doing forever.
Yeah.
Right. So I think it's more like response, right? I think building owners, in the world of construction, it's so, let's just say, architecturally driven on the design side, contractor driven on the construction side to control costs, right? I think owning buildings, right, especially institutional owners, like the one that brought us together, right? You own them forever, right? So the process that we go through on the commissioning side is paramount to ownership.
Yeah, these are. I think it stems from the fact that buildings stopped working; they weren't working anymore, and they needed someone to tell them why it wasn't working, or make sure it does work. And for the reason he just mentioned, most of these folks that are investing in commissioning are owners of buildings at scale or for a very long period of time. Yeah. And so it will directly impact their livelihoods, their day-to-day, if the buildings don't work, right?
Yeah.
And so most of the buildings that we're working on are going to be there on that campus or in that portfolio for 50 years or more. Mm-hmm. Most of these higher education institutions, it's hundreds of years, and they may revitalize them, like a lot of the ones we're working on some right now at UGA's campus that are 55 years old, and they're starting over in another life. So
this is a terrible example, but like this is the equivalent of going out and getting a Carfax before you buy something, right? Like you're making sure that it works the way it is promised to work. And also, from an owner's perspective, if I'm Melanie, if I'm putting myself in Melanie's seat, if I install brand new whatever HVAC, because it's easy to pick at, and it's not quite functioning just the way it's supposed to, like in 6 months, I'm going to end up needing to replace that whole freaking thing. And maybe it's out of warranty, or maybe there's some other stuff that prevents that from happening. There's a ton of cost savings that goes into that from a maintenance perspective too.
Yeah. What's interesting too about this is that those buckets of money that fund buildings are often entirely different buckets of money than operate those buildings. Yeah. And so there's a disconnect there. We don't necessarily close that gap. Good owners try to do it themselves, not with the funding itself, but with collaboration amongst those departments. But commissioning can be a bit of a bridge for that, because our livelihoods are testing buildings, many projects at a time, maybe not on the same day, but we touch a lot of buildings, a lot of projects, a lot of systems that work or don't. And so we know what works, we know what doesn't from that. And so we can convey that to them, and they hopefully, starting really early on a project, early design phase, so that hopefully they will understand why we're making certain recommendations, why we're suggesting not doing certain things. Because in the end, someone that carries a bag of tools has to maintain these systems, these buildings every day. And not enough people are looking out for that guy or gal. And so, that's a big part of what we're trying to do. And
at the end of projects for us, we'll turn over a project, and training is a part of the commissioning cycle for us too, right? We come in after the commissioning is done and the building's about to be turned over. It's material complete, right? We're going to go through training process with the building owners and their maintenance staff to talk about, we're not telling them how to turn a wrench. That's what their profession is. Right? They know how to do that, right? We don't need to tell them that. What we need to tell them is what's in their building, because oftentimes that's what they don't know, right? They just spent, let's just say they just spent $70, $60 million for a new building, right? But they're stepping in it for the first time. Walls are perfectly closed up. They have no idea where the pipes are. They have no idea where the wiring is, right? They have no idea what's in the building even, right? They just know that they have a building. and now they're expected to go maintain it. Well, we just helped assemble the thing. We saw it before the drywall was up, right? We documented what was behind those walls, right? We documented what equipment showed up, right? And then we had to test it. And we figured out what was wrong with it or what wasn't wrong with it, right? We left it in a position for a certain reason, right? Maybe we tweaked this or that, and we went back through the design engineer and said, hey, we want to change X to Y. And they said, okay, well, who documents that, right? And who lets the owner know at the end of the day that that was changed during the construction or commissioning cycle? Because the operators, the guys that maintain the buildings every day, they're going to need to know it, right?
IoT, like the whole Internet of Things, like keeps kind of popping up in my mind. You're trying to help somebody understand how something's been built. You're trying to help somebody understand what they have. And laboratories is something you guys work in. I can see that being that it's complex. Like that would just really ask for something like this to be done. So you're coaching the people that are in the operations side up as a part of what you do. They're going to understand better like how the lab works, like how the equipment works and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, a lot of that equipment's going to be application specific, right? So building we just got done doing together, poultry building, right? It's got a bunch of random things that poultry buildings have, not that other science buildings have, right? Next science projects that we're going to do, we're going to have more broad science-based applications rather than just poultry, right? So, I mean, it does get very building application specific, and it's not a broad stroke where it's just a rooftop, right? There's different nuances for every single solitary building.
Yeah, and in labs in particular, there's just a ton of interconnectivity. You cannot turn on and off a thing without it generally impacting something else or even changing a setting. Without it impacting things. They're extremely interconnected in laboratory buildings where the first rule is safety. And we're not talking fire safety, though that's, of course, paramount. But fume hood protection, safely working with chemicals inside of a fume hood, that's all contingent on the exhaust system working. The exhaust system can only work properly if it's got sufficient power to it, if it's got redundancies in it, and then it's got proper supply air from a different unit that makes up the air into that fume hood, and that the chill water is going to that air handler to make sure it's cool enough so that it doesn't rain in the building, right? So it's so they are more complicated than plenty of buildings that commercial buildings do work in. And so yes, commissioning is a natural fit in those environments.
I'd say the same for like any other mission critical building you run across, right? Whether it's a data center, right, that has, N plus X, right, in terms of redundancy. Well, how do you test all that redundancy, right? How do you make sure if one thing fails, the next thing starts in turn as it's supposed to, right? Going through those iterations. And, especially with what's kind of happening in our local marketplace with a lot of the industrial sector coming back. I mean, locally, very strong industrial sector coming back, seeing a massive demand for, light industrial facilities that have major redundancies or are mission critical themselves.
Yeah, commissioning is not a new term it's like a staple in the data center world and in healthcare where these critical systems already exist. It's only kind of becoming known in less complicated, you might say, but I mean, we do projects for fast food. Because they have some complex projects, or they're putting systems in that are more complicated than they were 5-10 years ago. Yeah, it's interesting times. It's not just labs or data centers anymore. Yeah.
Our houses are getting more complex. I mean, this just knowing how to operate all of the things that you can interconnect in your home has become more complex, let alone a fast food restaurant that now is trying to integrate robotics of some sort or, have some sort of integration with new computer systems that are actually running the building. I want to put my hand on the end of the process where you're helping operations grab it. We talked about how it was kind of a long arc of development and how, you're there at the beginning too. This is very much a cradle to grave thing when it's done well. So discuss that. What's it like trying to coach the designers up when you are able to be there for that?
So, a big end, part of the way it ends is that training that Jeffrey mentioned as you're trying to put your hand on it. But that really starts with the beginning of a project, which is for us in the programming stages of a project. So the project is going to exist. The building is going to be built in theory, but the owner is still figuring out what it exactly will be. They know what's going to go in it, who wants to occupy it generally. So where it starts is with the development of an owner's projects requirement document, OPR. And in commissioning, that ties directly to commissioning, but it's really an owner's document. It just says, here's what we need the building to do and be. And the commissioning agent's just well positioned to facilitate the creation of that document on their behalf and ask them a bunch of questions about what they want it to be. And that's where it really starts looking out for the maintenance man, is what do they need it to be? And that often can mean, what do they need it to not be? Like, what can it not be? And that's being cognizant of what they can and cannot manage in operations. I mean, I've seen a lot of, and I'm a big sustainability advocate, I've seen a lot of LEED certified, LEED platinum buildings fail because they were too complicated to operate by the people that have to run them every day. And so, yeah, it really starts with figuring out what you need, what do you need it to do, and honestly, a lot of it comes down to how can we do that in the most simple way possible, even if it's complicated.
That's right. It's the KISS method, right? It's the keep it simple, stupid, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's very basic, right? But I think for Darren and I specifically, I mean, he talked about his growing up in and out of attics and things like that. My father was a maintenance man in the industrial world for 35 years. He was a welder before that. So like Darren, I've known how to weld since I was very young. Could wire my house if I needed to, that kind of thing, right? So I think the big thing that he and I are able to do, just speaking personally, right, is communicate, right? We've done it. We've now done it for others. We've seen it done by others. We've seen the full arc, right, cradle to grave, right? Now, how do we take those experiences and communicate them backwards, right? And I think one thing that Melanie would say about both of us is that we're effective communicators, right? And not every engineer is. Not every person that finds themselves in our industry can communicate well, right? We just happen to be able to. And so I think that for us specifically, it's, we can take those experiences, those extrapolations, right? That we see starting in design, we see carried over in construction, and then we see the maintenance guys pay for them year after year after year. And then we come back to retro commission them, right? As an existing building, we come back and try to solve a problem and say, oh, well, this was just kind of designed a little wrong to begin with, right? This was never going to be maintainable. It's never going to be maintenance friendly. You were never going to have access to this, right? It wasn't just how it was built. It wasn't the manufacturer's problem. It was just kind of forgotten about, right? And how do we bring that forward?
Well, and so because you were getting at a point about how do we coach up architects and engineers. I mean, they are probably the hardest ones from the start of when commissioning started to get going to make them aware of what we're there to do. Because if you're sitting in their position, and I haven't done design engineering in my career, not really, a little bit of lightweight stuff, but mostly not. But if you're sitting in their position, you're like, these are the police to tell me that I'm speeding or I'm doing it wrong. And it's a natural position to sit in and think, you're here to make me look bad, or you're going to find a way to do that to justify getting paid. And I in general, I've found that good architects and good engineers do not have problems with the process. They may stand their ground on a design decision if we say, hey, we think this may not work as well if you maybe tweak it this way or just don't do that. We've seen that not work. They may hold their ground, but they'll do it on some solid foundations, and they appreciate the process. They know that we're not there to make them look bad. That doesn't, we don't get paid by the review comment or the deficiency, right? And so good ones get it, and we like to work with those. We're fortunate to get to work with quite a few good ones, and the ones that are more difficult, you just have to power through and be on the lookout for the owner's sake. In the end, we're there to represent their interest.
And I'll say that it's also not like zero. Well, it is kind of zero sum, right? Meaning that if there's something that we want to catch in design, right, or something we want to try to educate someone about, or just make a suggestion about, right? We might make it in passing. We might write a comment about it, right? We'll do design reviews as the design's being developed, leave some comments behind. It's very rare that those things don't come back, right? Right? They're gonna come back. You're gonna see them come back in construction. when someone's having trouble even installing the thing that was never going to fit there in the first place, right? You're going to have trouble at startup when those two things just don't work well together that we told you wouldn't work well together, right? And then you might have trouble during testing, right? When an interlock between two things isn't quite playing out the way you expected it to play out, right? So like it is kind of zero sum in the sense that we know the process. We know we're eventually going to get there, and we're just trying to save you a little bit of time, maybe even save you a few change orders.
Here's the thing is that I don't think a lot of them realize a lot of engineers will pick on them for a second, right? They're issuing out these drawings that have this spec on them, or they have a specific detail on them shown. And then they get their dander up because, holy cow, they're telling me that this is wrong, is something's going to go wrong. They haven't had that feedback yet. Mm-hmm. They've been stamping that detail out for the last 50 projects. But the thing is you guys haven't been there to say, hey, you realize they're having to do this, right? Mm-hmm. There's a little bit of a defense mechanism that kicks in there. Well, I've done this 50 times.
I've never been called that there's something wasn't working. I was like, that's not necessarally because everything works.
They made it work and they didn't tell you.
Right. And maybe they didn't call you ever again.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah. But in our field, a lot of engineers. So I remember when I did my first kickoff meeting for commissioning, and it's at the beginning of construction. We're pretty close, really about the time the MEP overhead starts, as those subs are on board, and you kick off the commissioning process for construction, talk them through it. And the guy I worked with back then said, make sure you ask people to raise their hand if they've dealt with a commissioning process before. This was 2005-ish, maybe 2006 probably. Yeah, 2006. And I was a little nervous anyway because I hadn't been in the business very long, but I can talk. I'll talk. My wife will tell you that. But I asked, and I don't know, 2 people, and this was at a big institution in Atlanta, a private institution. And so I was a little surprised. Today, I asked that same question. Almost everybody, even on simpler projects, have dealt with the commissioning process, including architects and engineers. And again, so plenty of them sort of get what we're trying to do, whether they like it or not, could be another matter, or they like who they're working with and, want to really, do they want to get another diatribe from Darren? I don't, maybe not. But yeah, their natural posture wants to be defensive. They have a standard of care. They're stamping a drawing set, and they put a lot of effort into that most of the time, even if they're copying and pasting certain details. And they don't like people telling them it doesn't or it won't work. And so communication, diplomacy is a huge part of what we do. You could say the same thing and make somebody really upset and get nothing accomplished, or you can be diplomatic about it, be professional. Know that if we were in the other, she was on the other foot, we'd want someone to be diplomatic and professional with us.
You guys have a lot of experience dealing with ticked off customers, I would imagine. Not necessarily customers, but like subs and engineers and architects, all that stuff. Mm-hmm. And we were talking about dealing with conflict a couple weeks ago.
I watched this episode. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How do you feel about conflict? What is your advice? Boots on the ground advice for that?
No,
right?
It was really good to hear his perspective about the whole, when you harbor the conflict, right, naturally you're going to become defensive over time, right, the longer you harbor it, right? And I think it makes a lot of sense. I think that's why, like, the way Darren and I like to approach, what we do has very little to do with what issue or comment we put on paper, and has everything to do with what happens next, right? It just, the material thing that is wrong, or maybe that we're advising for or against, right, is almost irrelevant, right? It's really, what are the reactions, right, that come next, whether it's in design or it's in construction, you're dealing with a sub, that are going to prevent the thing that you're trying to prevent, or going to cause the thing that you're trying to cause. So a lot of times you're really kind of trying to reverse engineer something. You're really trying to start with the conclusion, right? We know where we're trying to get. How do we best get there, right? Sometimes it might be trying to help someone see your perspective so that the idea maybe originates from somewhere else, right? Maybe you want to have a meeting on the side with the engineer that says, hey, let's talk about this. Let me tell you what I've seen over the years and talk about another instance where this was done, right? And what I learned from it. Or maybe you're doing the same exact thing with the 10 knocker in the field, right? And saying, hey, let's talk about the way that you are piping that VAV up there, right? That reheat, and how we like to see it piped like this because of access, right? Because of maintenance, because once you leave here, you're not coming back. But the guy that we serve is going to be here the next day, right? And he's going to need access to that thing. And we want him to have access to it, right? So it really is the communication technique. That's going to be the predictor of if you are successful or not.
You got to find the angle.
Have to.
You have to.
You're a
find the
salesman.
angle.
You have to find the angle.
Very much so.
Yes.
Yeah, you have to let that be their idea.
No
That's
doubt.
powerful.
Yeah.
It's very powerful. It's very hard to do.
It's hard to do.
It takes a lot of work to do
in
that.
reality, conflict is a given in our business and construction. You're not gonna avoid conflict or tension at all. And another thing that I like to joke about in a kickoff meeting is that everyone likes each other right now. But when we're 3 months out from turnover and we should be a lot farther along than we are for whatever reason, pre-COVID, post-COVID, there's a million reasons we could talk about, but we're not going to like each other as much. Get that up. Let's go ahead and say that today. Let's say it up front, but that doesn't mean we don't have a job to do, work together, solve problems. Because that's the main thing that I find in meetings where people are butting heads and conflicts are starting is they're usually not solving any problems. Okay, so commissioning agent's a good position to say, hey, I say it all the time, just the commissioning guy, which is a silly thing to say, but it allows us to reset and talk about solving the problem. Where we're at today, there's a problem. Is there more than one way to solve it? Let's figure out one of the ways that'll get it done. And everybody will be, in the end, everyone will be happy if you do that.
That's right. And I think in order to be able to say what Darren's saying now, like thoughtfully in the field to professionals in their respective trade, right? Whether you're an engineer or an architect or the maintenance guy or the mechanical tradesman doing the install work, right? You have to have had some experience from their perspective, right? You have to have been on that side. And I'm not even saying professionally for a lifetime. I'm just saying even for a moment, right? And I think that's one thing that might disconnect today's engineers from engineers 30 years ago or 40 years ago is that there was probably a lot more time spent in the field then, right? Than there might be today, right? It's really easy to just put lines on paper today. It's really easy to think that BIM and Revit are going to do all the engineering for you, right? Because, I always struggled when I was a design engineer that I wasn't really engineering anything. It was really just application, right? I was taking a product that was already engineered by someone else and I was applying it, right, to whatever project I was working on. And the problem with application is that in a building, you're applying many disparate things, right? You're applying things that oftentimes were not manufactured by the same manufacturer, right? Maybe they were never envisioned to be applied together at all, right? But you're applying them. And so have you really thought through everything that happens in between those applications?
I've got so many directions. I feel like we could go, but I want to pick a scab.
Pick. I'm excited.
Well, it's the designer thing. Like we've talked about this, and we get a lot of reaction out of the industry when it comes to the state of design. So can you speak a little more on what you're seeing? Because you've been in it long enough to have seen some sort of progression or regression. Are we in a state of regression from the standpoint of designers?
I don't think that. I think we've basically gotten what we've asked for, right? Like a lot of things in the capital way, right? The engineer of record still is the engineer of record. They hold the liability, right? They pay for liability insurance, right? So if something goes wrong, they hold the pot, right? As the commissioning agent, I don't hold anything, right? As the subcontractor, right, to the general contractor, right, good luck getting to me, right? As the engineer of record, I'm pretty well exposed, right? And oftentimes a very easy finger to point, in terms of lawsuits and things like that, right? I wouldn't say that it's because engineers lack integrity or lack the desire to do the right thing or lack the know-how, right? I think at the same time, there's, in terms of supply and demand, right, dwindling number of engineers, right, massive demand for construction, for engineering, right, has forced engineers and architects alike, right, in order to stay profitable, to push some of their production overseas. It's no different than every single thing that we buy, right? Why do car companies push manufacturing overseas? Well, to stay profitable, right? There's a reason that we don't put lines on paper here anymore. There's a reason that we don't, pay a degreed engineer to wire 30,000 light fixtures, right, on paper, because it's just not necessary, right?
Yeah, and engineers have just gotten farther away from the product. The product they make is three-dimensional model or ultimately in 2 dimensions, and then contractor goes and builds that. That's not the product, though. The product is the building. And they get farther and farther away from that over time with diminishing construction administration fees. You could argue that you could put all the commissioning scope under a robust construction administration activities and probably be okay, but engineering's just gotten so far away from that for a variety of reasons. And if you just say it's about their fees and they only go to the job site for cover-up inspections, then they don't see what building is. And so why should they appreciate what it takes to climb a ladder through a ceiling to a piece of equipment that's 5 feet above that ceiling when the ceiling's 12 feet above the floor and understand why that may not be great, right? And so, again, we've seen it enough to where it doesn't work. And the idea is to convey to them that, it's the same product. They're putting the same things on paper, or just doing it in a smarter way, right? And the outsourcing of scope these days, I think is an interesting topic. Maybe we'll get into, but in the end, that just pushes engineering, the drawing, the design farther away from the product, and a lot of it is demand. The demand is just insane for design and construction right now. You cannot get a piece of equipment, electrical gear. You have to order it. We're ordering most of our projects electrical switch gear off of a design development package. That means you had to have made all these decisions about the building at the DD release. Mm-hmm. And if you don't, and if you haven't, then you've pushed out the construction that's already in 2025 right now. Which is just this wild concept. It's to the point where there are data center owners who are helping electrical vendors that make gear build their own, like they're collaborating to build a production facility so that they can get their gear in a timely manner. And so, our part about it and the engineers being farther away, like, okay, add it to the list of complexities and messiness that is construction.
Well, and then enter the product manufacturers themselves, right? Because they carry a lot of weight, right? These manufacturers that make this equipment, they're billion-dollar industries, right? Mm-hmm. And they've got sales guys, right? They've got people that are in the marketplace pushing products and saying that, yeah, my product does that. Well, who's to say it does, right? And who's
gave a great presentation in our office for a lunch.
That's right. And your product does that if I buy all these options with it. Well, who's specifying those options? And does the engineer really understand that it doesn't just come out of the box like that, right? You've got to specify all these other things to come with it, right? In order to get that product that they're telling you that they can deliver to you, right? And then enter a competitive marketplace, right? Because Darren knows exactly where I'm about to go with this, but one unit manufacturer, you specify it one way, and then as let's say a public entity, they got to go shop those units, right? They got to go get some competitive bids, and they're trying to compare apples to apples. Well, who's doing all the homework to make sure they're apples to apples? Is it really in the general contractor's interest to say that they're not apples and apples? Not really. They need the competitive bids, right? They need those bids. Otherwise, they're continuing boots on the ground trying to find apples and apples, right? And, to the engineer of record, right, they want to stand in we have our basis of design, right? We want our basis of design. So they don't want to do all the homework to compare apples and oranges, right? Because it's a lot of work to go through those submittals and say that unit is disqualified because it's not an apple, right? It's an orange. So enter the commissioning agent, right? We're there to really be in that middle ground, right? Be the guy that's trying to identify where the apples and the oranges deviate.
You had, in our pre-call, I want to say, we talked about this whole thought that the designers, because of outsourcing, have become somewhat disconnected, but that there was a thought that you put it, that they've become design managers more than designers. Can you speak to that a little?
Yeah, I mean, again, a lot of the design is coming down to pretty junior engineers. If it's here, if it's not, if it's outsourced, then a lot of that design is being done, overseas. And then really what the engineer or engineers are doing is managing the design process more so than designing the buildings, right? And again, if you have a real downward push on your costs, this makes complete sense. But again, it doesn't make for great engineering, when that's happening. And there's nothing wrong with outsourcing. I don't see any particular issue with outsourcing drafting and those things, but you still need to be connected and from an engineering perspective to what the building needs to do and be, and understand how it's got to work in order for the owner to be happy with it, wherever it's drawn and detailed. Again, that almost doesn't matter. But if your primary job is to manage other people drawing things, I just don't know how you could be as connected as if you were running your own load calculations, understanding controls of building systems. That's really what all these systems come back to, is controls now. And most engineers have very little, particularly in their youngest years, very little understanding of what controls are. And it's embedded in the design process still to this day, for the most part, in engineering, that the controls, building automation, mechanical, electrical systems, sometimes plumbing systems, the last thing you put on the drawings is the controls, which in my view should be the first thing, or one of the first things, because that is the operational intent, right? How you get to it exactly, the little I/O points and all these pretty, tables and stuff maybe don't have to be there, but the operational intent is controls, and writing that out at the very beginning is critical. And if you're trying to understand how a building works in engineering, that's what you should be doing. It's just not built around that. Yeah.
Is that because controls are picked and the way you get to and from them are industry standards?
Well, I mean, in reality, today buildings, most commercial buildings, complex or otherwise, are controlled. Like, there is a control program in a controller, not all that different than a computer, that program says this is how this piece of equipment works. We turn a compressor on and off, we vary a fan speed, we start a pump, we turn off a pump. That's controls, right? And for those things to happen, you need to write out what you want it to do. But it's often waits to the very end of the project to write. Engineers are fine, because it's been in the industry for decades, to draw piping, show a pump, draw an air handler, show that that's a thing that has to be bought. The controls piece is the piece that's often, I don't say forgotten, but it's neglected until the very end. And it has just such a critical piece of a building that works or doesn't work.
And I'll speak to why I think that is, just from my own design experience, right? So before train trace and carrier hap and load calculators, right, that would do loads for you, right? You basically tell it what size the rooms are and where the exposures are and what the wall properties are. This thing will calculate all your loads and tell you what your tonnages are, right? Before that, you started from the diffuser and you worked backwards, right? So you started in a room in a building and you said, okay, I've got these windows and walls in this room. This is how much air I need. And then you move to the next room. Windows and walls, this is how much air I need. Windows and walls, this is how much air I need, right? And then you added it all up, right? And you brought all that back to your trunk line that was going to be fed off, feeding all these various rooms. You bring it to your trunk, and then you combine that trunk with other branches, and then you bring all that back to the piece of equipment, right? So you had to design all of these rooms before you could get to the piece of equipment, right? So there's this natural tendency for engineers, I think, in the design process to think that the more complete their ductwork and piping drawings and all these things are, right, the more complete their design is. Well, you kind of marry that, or at least compare that to what the construction process, the overarching process is actually telling them what their priorities are, right? Because the overarching process is telling you that your priorities should be cost-driven, right? So it's while you have this natural tendency to design from the very end backwards, you have this overarching this overarching problem, right? That's telling you that you need to design from the front forward, right? Not from there backwards, right? So you have these conflicting kind of things playing at each other, right? Where you're trying to develop your design, get all your numbers right. And then you've got the system from the top down pushing on you saying, yeah, but you haven't told me what that air handling unit is yet. And it's like, well, how can I? I haven't finished the design. It's like, well, we need to know. It's DD, right? We got to price it. We got to start competing all this. So it's really we're just trying to do it all so fast, right? And we're still trying to do it the same way that it was done years ago, just with some technology, right, in there, in the middle. And I think a lot of people dreamed that when Revit came out, that you would just be able to design the building visually and it would just size everything for you, right? Well, as any Revit user would tell you, it just doesn't work that way right now, right? The models need to know way too much in order to make those overarching assumptions, right? We are really good at assumptions, right? I think that anyone who's been designing for a while could look at a building and pretty well tell you what it's going to require, right? Without some caveats, right? But still, as the engineer of record who holds all, right, absolutely every ounce of risk, right? It's still their due diligence to do it the way design is done, which is out there working backwards, right? And the process is still going to try to push you the other way.
I love it because now we're looking at something that I think is actually beneficial for our industry to have a brainstorm on together, right? So we talked about outsourcing, but like not trying to demonize it, just trying to talk about it. We're talking about the way we design, not trying to demonize a way we design, but trying to talk about it and think about it. We're trying to reframe around a lot of these new tools as an industry. We've had this whole tech and tactics talk. I mean, numerous times. We've got a whole podcast on how, sometimes the tech or tools that you have, they outstrip your tactics, and tactics need to be adjusted. And so this is a great example of how tactics in our design need to be adjusted. And it makes me think of another one. Kelly Doyle mentioned this in his episode, but the slow is smooth, smooth is fast, the old military thing that we try to design to get to DD so that we can buy the things that are critical. And we fast track everything, but that's a dog pile design. We throw a bunch of stuff at the wall very quickly, but we don't really think all the way through it. And then when we get this amalgam of just, whatever that comes out of it, we faint surprise.
Yep.
Oh my gosh, how could it have been disorganized? And how might I have seen two systems that might not be compatible? Well, we didn't stop and think first.
What's funny is 10, 15 years ago, commissioning agents didn't really get involved in, if we were on early in design, we would be in design meetings, we would do design page turns, we'd do comments. These days, I sit in more VE meetings, value engineering meetings, than any design discussion meetings. It's mostly, it's too expensive, we got to take that out. It's too expensive, we got to take that out. And it's, like to your point, it's happening so fast. That's the forest for the trees stuff. Like we're not thinking about the fact that this building is going to be on that property for at least 100 years. It'll probably only get remodeled one big time in 50 years. And we're talking about releasing electrical gear a week from right now for a building that we just finished VEing down to almost nothing, so that we can hit a turnover date in the third quarter of 2025. Like, hello. I'm like, we're not thinking this through clearly. And I'm not saying that I don't understand and appreciate those scenarios. I really do. But I think someone's got to just ask, are we sure we got to do this right now? And just big picture, back up just for a minute.
It points to why Darren brought up design managers. I mean, you see why it's necessary, right? You see why engineers are becoming managers, because they're managing the process, right? That the industry's demanding, right? So they're responding. I think that in the design world, as a designer, what I used to tell young designers a lot was just, don't worry, don't get so wrapped up in the details of your design to the extent that you think that it's going to end up the way you put it on paper. Remember that someone's got to build it, right? And remember that the way they build it isn't guaranteed to be the way that you put it on paper, right? So what's more important, right, is everything else, right? How does all this work together from a big picture, right? How does it all work together, right? And so young engineers, they lack that experience, that expertise, right? It's, a chicken and egg kind of, right, smoke and fire kind of thing. What do you teach them first? You bury them in the field, right? Do you teach them how to design from the front backwards, or do you start making them managers from day one, right? So I think it's kind of grappling with what the industry is demanding, what the process and, Darren talked about lead times and things like that, right? What that's demanding, and it's that conflict with how you train, right? How you bring these guys up and get them experience, because it's kind of evolving right now. Right?
Yeah, I think ultimately it needs to start in school. And I think there's some care taken around STEM, certainly education, and a big push for that, which I think is great. I don't know that there's as much hands-on learning that could be done. And I didn't have a ton of it in college, but the little we did do, we had a welding class, and I was terrible at it, but it was informative. You learn a lot and see what trades do. I mean, by far my best education was doing HVAC service and installation work. I mean, I just learned a ton from seeing what it takes to do a thing and the frustrations on a guy's face when he can't get it right, or it's not going to work for him and stuff. And I think it can start, and it probably should start in college. Go spend a semester co-oping with an installer, right? Go do that. Make it mandatory, among maybe some other things. But and management too, because engineers aren't terribly inclined to be people persons. I don't know. I mean, a lot of them we deal with, they're pretty good at staring at their shoes, and not, and there's nothing wrong with that. But a lot of what we have to do is, designers have to do is manage people, manage expectations, manage a process, and that requires a lot of interaction with people. Maybe one day it won't, but today it still does.
I got to give Brent Hanlon a shout out, because he's one of those engineers that is really, really good at the communication part of things. Like, he's really good at just working with you, right? And not just sitting there staring at your shoes. That's what separates the okay-ish engineers from the great engineers, in my opinion. It is that communication piece.
Yeah, I can't argue that. I think in the end, it's a terrible cliche, but we're in the people business, and we draw things and design things and say what they need to do, and there's plenty of liability for engineers to do that. Mm-hmm. But in the end, it's a people business. You gotta be able to figure out how to communicate, or if you want to succeed, in my view, you have to have communication skills.
Feels like in recent years that is, and I can only speak from my own experience, but from talking to Eddie, from talking to Dad, from talking to my grandfather, mm-hmm. communication has gone downhill so much. And the only thing I can kind of point at is technology. Mm-hmm. But I think it's a growing pain. Mm-hmm. It's a growing pain. We're not sure how this fits in, because we were building with paper for thousands of years, right? Like, only over the last, I'll say 30 probably,
Mm-hmm.
have we started digitizing things.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're trying to grapple with that switch. And we're not sure how it all works together. And so, that's the reason for all of these little dysfunctions along the way.
Well, and the communication used to happen, like, let's just say you're in the field with a contractor. You need something to change. The engineer's on site. It's like, hey, we're running into this problem. We got to, what do we do, right? Let's brainstorm about what we do, right? That communication is happening in situ, right? I mean, you are boots on the ground, right? You have an absolute, right, respect for the scale, right? And for every other peripheral thing that may be there, right? For the most part, most of that direction, that field direction, comes via email these days.
Yeah.
Right? That's it. Bottom line, maybe you got some photos, right? But I mean, that's the real rub, is that that communication's trying to happen virtually. And it's a really challenging thing to address appropriately virtually, right? You really got to put your boots on the ground to get the right solution.
And the technology is not, there's a lot of bells and whistles talked about with 3 dimensions walking through. I mean, we do a lot of BIM model fly-throughs to see what can be seen, see what's going to fit. And it's still not, it's a great representation, but it's not the same as standing up underneath the thing and looking up at it physically. And the technology hasn't gotten us to the point where you can do it completely virtually. So there's just still something to be said for standing there and looking at it and understanding the scale, the perspective, the ratio of things. And yeah, again, engineers get farther away from job sites, that it's harder to do that.
I mean, that happened to me at detailing. I detailed a hospital and, I stared at that thing every day for a couple months.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went and visited. And then I went, holy crap.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like, that's what that bolt looks like.
Mm-hmm.
I held it and went, how many of those did I specify on this job?
Yeah.
A couple thousand, and
Right.
it freaks you out. You're
Yeah.
like, oh my gosh, this is real stuff.
It's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
It is.
There's a ton of that, a ton of the need for that perspective.
Mhm.
Get out there, see it, feel it
Yeah.
in the heat.
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
it's raining.
Yeah.
And then see what those
It
trades
certainly
folks
builds
do.
respect, right? I mean, you
Heck
build
yeah.
respect for the guys
Appreciation.
that are doing it, right?
Heck yeah.
And the ones that you're directing to do it, right? And understanding, like,
And the ones that are yelling at you, I've been doing this 35 years. Like, yeah, I know, I get it. And I respect that. So,
Right on,
so
right on.
seriously, and
Yeah.
trying to appreciate that perspective. I mean, just seeing it is a great way to do it.
and it's, I mean, and I'll say, I guess the elephant in the room really is that the situation is not going to get any better anytime soon. It's only going to get worse, right? Trade industries, supply of good trade workers, certainly not skyrocketing anytime soon,
and,
right?
And a lot of the best ones are on massive billion-dollar data center builds, like the A teams.
They're
of
going
all
to get
these
the A
trades.
teams. That's
That's
right.
where they go. And so everybody else gets what's left. And plenty of those are very good. I'm not saying they are not.
Yeah.
It's just a different world. It's not going to get better.
Mm-hmm.
Commissioning is not, I love what I do and I tell everyone they should do it, but it can't solve this problem. It can only be a little piece of it. As much as we can be involved, we want to be, but we can't, solve this huge
I think it goes
challenge.
back to what Eddie said too about working within the confines that we have, right? Working with the tools, right? Like I'm, talking about lacking respect for, let's say, BIM versus the field. That doesn't mean that BIM doesn't have a place. It doesn't mean that a digital twin in the future doesn't have a place, right? It absolutely does, right? But it can't be divorced from the reality, right? It can't be separated from really understanding what's being built and how and who's doing it and how they're doing it, right? It's the only way to really get it right. Otherwise, it's just going to end up right the way that they in the field knew how to do it, right? And that's it.
So I have a request.
Okay.
All right. So I feel like we got more in the tank,
Mhm.
but I also feel like we're kind of arriving at a natural ending.
Yeah.
Okay. So can we do a candid after show? Like just a little more talk.
Okay.
But let's get the megaphones, and then we'll
do
hit
a
the
little
candid
bit of
after
a-
show, and then maybe we'll be brave enough to throw it out there. 'Cause, like I want to maybe
Fair
ask
enough.
some of the spicy questions there, and then we'll just see how it goes.
Fair enough.
Okay, so cue up the megaphone.
For paid subscribers. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, behind the paywall. No, not doing that to you.
That's awesome.
Yeah. All right. So we'll ask our megaphone question. So if we gave you a megaphone in around 60 seconds to speak to the whole industry, what would you want to say? What did you want to leave with?
Darren said this earlier in the show. And it's something that when I go back and talk to young engineers, and I've done that a few times, go back to UGA or other places, and a lot of times they expect that it's going to be talking about my industry, right? And I have one common one that I do. It is just called Know Your Worth, and it's really how do you calculate your worth, right? We're engineers; we like to calculate things. Well, there's 2,080 man hours in a year, right? It's pretty easy to calculate your worth, right? And so know your worth. But even more paramount than that to me, a lot of engineers, a lot of young students, a lot of young people in general talk about, and I went through the same existential struggle, right? I don't know what I want to do, right? No one ever knows what they want to do. Well, a lot of people tell you that all the time, right? I never knew what I wanted to do, right? Even after 60 years, people might say 60 years, I'm 60 years old and I don't know what I want to do with the rest of my life. But if there's one thing that I have learned in my own life, it's that even though I don't know what I want to do, I know what I don't want to do because of things that I've done, right? So to the students out there, right, to the young trades workers, do the things, right? Go weld, go wire, go study, right? Go read, go hike, do the things, right? Because the only way to really know what you want to do is to first identify what you don't want to do.
That's really good. All right, Darren, have fun with that one.
Yeah, that's not next. Cool, man.
That's why you want to go first.
Yeah, sounds right. Unlike last night in the Superbowl. No, okay.
Yeah, that's true.
Something I haven't thought about a lot is what I would do when I stop, because I don't really know yet when that'll be. I'm still relatively young, but I know what I'll tell my kids about what they want to do, and I would say the same thing to engineers or tradespeople. Is take pride in what you do. Take your work serious, not too serious, but take pride in it, and you'll find success. You'll feel good about what you do. And if you don't like it, to Jeffrey's point, don't do that anymore. Go do something else that you do like to do, and take pride in that. And I think I was taught that growing up is work is good. And doing it well is important. If you're going to do a thing, do it all the way, right? And I think that I'm certain there's not enough of that out there. And I don't have a particular insight as to why, but try the different things, to Jeffrey's point. It's why my son plays like 4 different sports just to see which ones he's not any good at and doesn't like. So try different things and take pride in the things that you decide to do. And the end product will be good. It'll be better than what it would have been otherwise. And I think that's absolutely true in construction. Like, take pride in it, care about it every day, and you will be just fine.
Yeah. It's good stuff, guys. I'm excited for the after show.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Got a lot more to say here. So. We'll see if we're bold enough to release it. Thanks for joining us, guys.
Yeah. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.